Kensington Unitarians in London, and she previously worked as our denomination's National Religious Education and Youth Officer, and before that was a teacher of religious education in secondary schools. Sheena Gabriel was raised in a Pentecostal church, brief time.
I know all about, please, I can't even say it, but the Spirit. I'm your girl.
She was delighted to discover 20 years ago the free-thinking perspectives of the Unitarians. And she became lay leader and is now minister at Meadrow Unitarian Chapel in Godalming in Surrey. Finally, we have Lewis Connelly, who's recently become minister of the Ipswich Unitarian Meeting House. Lewis was born in Scotland, raised in Texas, educated in England. He's fascinated by the search for a contemporary non-realist approach to doing theology. You can ask him what that means during the questions. He's formerly an Anglican curate, and Lewis is married to Kat, an Anglican priest in training. So now I will hand over to our panel.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nikki. Thank you very much, Jim. I think the key sign of being a panelist is that we've all been scribbling furiously all day, and we're now going gibber, gibber, gibber. We're going to finish at past, and that doesn't give us much time, so I will crack on. What I wanted to say is that I really appreciate days like this, and in truth, it's not because theology is my favourite form of expression, because it's not, but there's just such a joy in getting together with people who I feel are following a similar path to mine. It's lovely to be here with our community. I've got that sense, and somebody else has just mentioned it, that this is where I belong in all our delightful diversity. And it's good to hear some proper, not improper, Unitarian theologians. There are quite a few of them out there, and I'm, for one, am keen to hear more in the years ahead. So I'm not going to speak for long on this panel, because I do want there to be a bit more time for you to have a chance to speak as well. But what I would like to emphasise is the value of dialogue. My path into a Unitarian community came from an invite to join a Building Your Own Theology course all those years ago. And even at the time, I remember noticing that it was building, not build. And so it's got that sense of theology as a provisional, ongoing process. And I think that those kind of conversations, when they're well facilitated, and I think we have a lot of very capable facilitators in our movement, they're a really valuable part of our Unitarian faith life, those small groups. So what I'd like to say is, let's keep talking together.
Well, I've appreciated today a great deal. It feels like today was almost built for me. I enjoyed it so much, especially hearing from all our various speakers. The question which kept on coming back to my mind as I heard the various presentations kept on coming back to this problem we have with our Unitarian identity. What is our Unitarian identity? And if we can't speak of a shared Unitarian identity, then how can we begin to speak of a shared Unitarian systematic theology? I think that's a very difficult and problematic question, but I definitely agree with Stephen Lingwood that we're not coming at Unitarianism as if it were a blank slate, but rather truth is contextualized in spaces and time, as it is contextualized in this space on Sunday mornings and contextualized in the churches and chapels and meeting houses that we all come from. To move towards, then, a catch-all theological identity seems problematic. In doing theology in the context in which we inhabit has much value. It enriches our spiritual life. We must stand up as an authentic alternative to mainstream Christianity or orthodox Christianity and create internally robust liberal religious space. The only kind, then, of Unitarian identity I am comfortable with, and I do like and want to get behind, is what Joe James was talking about, this idea of the egalitarian immanent spirit. Though it's more difficult to see how policy can be built on that, or indeed how any systematic theology can be built upon it. Unitarianism then feels more like a kind of subjective quality that we enter into in spaces as opposed to something we can necessarily write down on paper. But nonetheless, today and experiences like this invite us to journey with each other and heighten together the quality of theological discourse. And that gets a big thumbs up from me, and I look forward to continuing this conversation with all of you.
Thank you.
Well, I'm one of those perhaps weird individuals who really loves theology. Not that I claim to be a theologian and be very good at it, but it excites me. And just coming here today, and I told a few people, well, I'm going away for the weekend to Manchester. Oh, what are you going to do? Are you going to see the sights? And I said, well, no, I'm going for a not very dirty weekend, looking at theology, discussing theology with my husband. So we're making a weekend of it. And maybe that says something about me, that I'm a bit sad, but I think theology has got a bad press, particularly in our movement. It's seen as something dry, desiccated, dull. It's to do with doctrine and the church, and that for me isn't what theology is. And I think there has been that change in recognition. It's in the word theo, logos, God, word. Theology is discourse about God. But I've heard some other definitions. Anthony de Mello, theology, the art of telling stories about the divine and the art of listening to them. And Karl Rahner, who Karl Barth, whose theology I can't cope with, he suggests that theology should be on par with looking at a beautiful landscape, Umbrian landscapes which hold us in awe on account of the breathtaking views they offer. And he stresses what he feels is the sheer excitement that theology can bring when it's done properly, rather than the dull, dry, boring, irrelevant view that so often it's named with. And I think we've suffered from that in our movement. And looking in the Unitarian Life that Stephen Lingwood edited, and there's that quote by John Haynes Holmes where he says, "When I say God, it is poetry and not theology. Nothing that any theologian wrote about God has helped me much, but everything the poets have written have at one time reached my soul. The theologians gather dust upon the shelves of my library, but the poets are stained with my fingers and blotted with my tears." And I want good theology that does that, because I think I was very struck by what Stephen said about, he said theology is not so much a science, but it's an art, it's poetry, and it's an experience of the heart. So for me, I think we've had a taste of that today. I haven't been able to take it all in. There's been too much to take in, but I've had moments where I felt that lift of poetry and inspiration, and I need to go home and process them. So that's been exciting for me. And the other key thing I think that's come out for me is the emphasis again on wedding the rational, the reasoning, the thinking with the experience, and the head and the heart, bringing them together, which I think is there in the thread that's come through the day of mysticism. It was in all of the papers in different ways. And I think that's where we are today in so much of spirituality and the church. And I came across a quote from Iris Murdoch. I think it's the subtitle of one of her books. "Must all religious people now be mystics?" That's her question. And my answer to that would be yes, I think they must. And that, well, am I allowed to say that? That's dogmatic, but that is my view, because I think that gets beneath all the wrangling about creeds, that core thread that we've seen touched on today. So I'll leave it there, but I think those are the things, the excitement about re-engaging in theology as poetry and a heart activity, not just a head activity, and that strand of mysticism embedded in reason, which I think we're in an ideal position to bridge that gap. And as a good old Pentecostal gal, of course, I'm delighted to see the Holy Spirit coming back into the conversation. So, thank you.
So our plan now is to open this up to you. I doubt that we'll be able to answer any of your questions, but you never know. But yes, let's hear some more voices.
Gavin Lloyd from the Oxford congregation. What has Unitarian theology to say about innocent human suffering and life after death?
Can we have our theologians back on the panel, please?
Okay. Oh, we're going to get a few questions, are we? That's really...
Okay, I'll write that down. That's all. Okay, so...
Looks like we're doing something now.
Yeah. So that was suffering and life after death. Thank you, Gavin. Yeah. Anybody else?
Please.
I'm not asking a question. No,
I would like to ask you about non-realism and Unitarianism then, insofar as I made a point earlier about Karl Barth and post-liberalism being one form of well, it's non-realism really. It's neither objective nor subjective. It's postmodern, and the Martineau being another way to the postmodern, the subjective being so strong it collapses any objectivity. So, but the Unitarian tradition has been one of simplified Christianity, simplified, make it pure, find the essence, find the kernel, what's left of the objectivity of it. It's very difficult to be non-realist when you don't have a given symbolic tradition that you're sort of undermining but keeping all the time. And you're an ex-Anglican, so you might understand that when you do a liturgy, a fixed liturgy, you give it non-realist interpretations quite easily, because you know it's a kind of a nonsense, even if it's a spiritual nonsense. But when you mean what you're saying, you say what you mean, it's quite difficult to be non-realist, isn't it?
Yeah. I think there's an ongoing problem with the use of religious language in our movement, where we always run into the problem where it's unclear to the uninitiated what we mean in the language that we use. So we throw around like God, a word like God, or we say the Lord's Prayer together, and I say the Lord's Prayer, for example, from non-realist perspective, or from a kind of Althusserian perspective of understanding that the objective God, or the God up there, has either never existed or is dead. And I think it can be helpful to step back and to just unpack that for people, just so they realize that there is a thick depth of metaphor that we use on Sunday mornings. And that can invite people into these types of spiritual conversations, which otherwise can feel quite alienated from them, I think.
Thank you for that. Maybe can I just quickly respond, Gavin, to you, because I didn't mean to be glib about suffering on earth and life after death, but I would have that in the category of lifelong questions that I would like us to create communities in which people can explore together and listen respectfully to each other on that. I don't think there is any one Unitarian or any other theology answer to those kinds of philosophical queries, which is not to say they're not important, because they're hugely important to people, aren't they?
And I would just say, to point people back to the fact that our theologians, our Unitarian theologians, have written quite a lot on those issues. If you look back at the books, there was quite a lot written about problem of suffering and life after death, and perhaps to go back to our roots and reread what people in the past have said, also to inform our own position now. So people like Arthur Long, I think, and Martineau, and
Nikki Jenkins, Minister to Chorlton Unitarians. I think I'm a pragmatist, really, and I do find rather a lot of this discussion a bit, well, so what-ish. But I was thinking about it, and I came into Unitarianism really through a path of reading people like Spong and Marcus Borg, progressive Christians, really. And it was through that I kind of had my own outlook legitimized. There was a sense that, oh, not only do other people think like me, but it's a proper thing, And so I think that's where the value of us trying to create some kind of Unitarian theology would be really helpful for people. And just recently somebody touched earlier on the different kinds of theology. They mentioned several different kinds of theology. And I was just recently heard something about something called Pastoral Theology, and it was a book by Grolsch Miller, I think. And I thought, now that to me would be very interesting, and I wonder if you've got any views about pastoral theology.
Want to come back to, Nikki?
And I feel that's a cop-out for me, because I'm sort of sitting here thinking, I've got a counselling background and I feel it's something I should know more about. And I have to say I don't, but I think it's something I would see it's something that relates to the way we communicate and interact with people, and brings in the psychological aspect as well of the human mind, the human psyche. So I'm speaking from ignorance here, because that term, I don't know a lot about it, but I think it adds another dimension that would bring in psychological references to the human psyche and the mind and development and personality. And I think that would be very relevant, obviously, to ministers and in ministry training, and something that perhaps that's a lack that we don't really know. We're not familiar with that term, even though we do pastoral, some pastoral, cover some of that, but the two together, perhaps. So,
and certainly those of us who studied at Unitarian College Manchester with Jan Berry from the United Reformed Church, that was an area that she was looking at, and one of the best things I remember her telling us all was, make sure that our liturgy is genuinely caring for people, that we don't become so obsessed with this is how we should do this. We forget the huge diversity of people who join us, even a small congregation on a Sunday morning.
Yeah, I guess you could also talk of us needing to capture a narrative for doing practical theology which is helpful in moving us forward. So, we've inherited certain patriarchal models of, vicar knows best, or the priest that stands over us and gives us the answer to try and set us forward in the right direction. And, these have increasingly been seen as incredibly unhelpful ways of framing the discussions. The shepherd and the sheep, that type of biblical idea. And what would some other narratives be like which would help us explore that in a more egalitarian way? That's more of that's more me putting a question back on your question, but there you go.
Thank you. Philip?
I was very I don't know if this works, but I was very Philip Colfox from Bridport. I'm also currently on the EC, and I'm trying to work on a sort of identity project as well. So I'm very interested in everything that's happening here today. Personally, and I think it's sometimes quite useful to think from a personal perspective, I'm not a believer that there is, in my theology, I don't believe that human beings can possibly describe the cosmology of the world any better than the physicists can do it, which is not very well really, because they keep on having to rework it every time you move up from O levels to A levels. You get told you've got to forget everything you've learnt before, and that's really the history of scientific development. So that's where I'm coming from. That our brains are not big enough to define the universe and how it all works. Who made it and all those other things. There's such problems, therefore, as, what was it called? I can't remember, Gavin, your problem, what was it? Undeserved suffering or something? Innocent suffering. Well, for me, on a theological basis, I'm interested in things that are useful. So if I was in a position where I thought I was, where I'd been picked on undeservedly, so I've rephrased your problem. I would be looking for methods of helping me deal with that problem. I wouldn't want to have a whole redefinition of the universe in order to help me solve that problem on a particular, on a personal basis. And I think this is very working through that all the various different problems and solutions and all that sort of thing is quite a useful way of looking at the marketing of what we do. So if I'm thinking of Unitarian identity so that I can explain to people who we are, we're really wanting to do that because we want more people to get involved. So I look at that as being a sort of sales and marketing type problem. And so looking at how I deal with a personal problem of suffering or whatever it is, what my theology is, or what techniques I use to make myself feel better, but would bring me onto the subject of thinking, what are the needs, personal needs of people that Unitarianism or the Unitarian approach can satisfy? What needs can we help? So it's really a completely different way of dealing with this problem than calling it a theological problem. But I think ultimately it is a theological problem. But I just use a lot of very different words.
Thanks. Neville Kenyon from Bury. I think almost related to that is how can we ensure that our theology is distinctive against the liberal wings of other religious organisations?
Sheena's just going to respond, and then we probably need to be drawing this to a close, but if you were somebody who had your hand up for a while, keep waving. Sheena, do you want to respond?
Yeah, well, I think one thing I didn't say, one of the other things that really struck me, and I wished we'd had longer to explore, was I think what I saw as Stephen's attempt to start doing that. He highlighted two things, the holiness, the goodness of the here and now, the immanence of goodness, beauty, holiness of the here and now, unfolding revelation, is a starting point. My question was going to be, is that distinct from other liberal traditions? And that was my question, which perhaps needs more exploring. But I think if we could build on that, start there, and perhaps find other things. Is there anything that's totally distinct? I don't know. I mean, you'll probably find pockets of Quakers, people within mainstream churches. I don't know, but I think Stephen's two things he offered us, which I hope when they're printed out we can expand on, was a great starting point, because I think that's what he was attempting to do, two distinct things that could be the core of our theology, and maybe to build on that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Glasgow. A long time ago I had a theological education. I still read theology, but I'm also a psychotherapist. And I think that people actually, I believe, are crying out for a 21st century spirituality that does not require supernatural belief, but is grounded in what we know about ourselves, our world, and what we need. I found Stephen's critique this morning very helpful, because I think we do suffer from the blank space. I mean, I think it's a real crisis for the Unitarian Church that we cannot really say what we have to offer except a container, that empty space. Come and build your own theology. But we don't really help people to address the big questions about life and how to live it. And I think we need to really do a lot more of this, a lot more hard thinking together about, and not be afraid to put out there some of the things that we think, we believe. It's all provisional. It doesn't have to be the ultimate and forever truth, but it's what helps us to move forward. And I think that we need that dialogue ongoing, because there is a big space in our society where people are looking for these answers.
And let's keep working away at the tricky work of creating healthy congregations, healthy communities where deep dialogue takes place, because that really is the important building block, isn't it? And also, let's not forget the importance of our own testimony. We've all got great stories to tell about why we would give our Saturday up to spend time together. Yeah, I'd like to hear those stories. So maybe if I can just ask you two, is there any final words?
Yeah, so, well, tying it back to the reading that we began with this morning, as we move forward, contextualizing our personal theology in our own context is only valuable in as far as it leads to the good fruits of our actions. So there you go. I leave that with you to go out and contextualize your own personal theology.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think that phrase, the challenge, there was a real challenge there. Our willful ignorance of the theology of the academy. We're not so cutting edge. Let's be reading Spong and Borg and all these other wonderful theologians that are out there. So two things that really stuck with me: where there are no roots, no fruits, and also Mel Prideaux's that lovely, sobering phrase, the failure of the chain of memory. And I know I have willful ignorance about some of the gaps in that chain in my own understanding, so I'm going to go away and try and link up some of those threads a bit more thoroughly. But also I think just emphasising theology, the art of telling stories about the divine. They're not definitive once and for all. If we could be a bit more playful, these are not truths cast in stone. They're stories about the divine and the art of listening to them. So,
thank you, everybody. Yeah, no final word from me at all. Only to say thank you, Jim Corrigal. Thank you very much. Thank you, Hibbert Trust.
Yes, exactly. And thank you to Cross Street Chapel and UK Unitarian TV. Cross Street for hosting and the TV for screening this as we go. Just to remind you all that there's a donation box as you go out, so please put your 1s, 5s and 10s in it. And let's end now with a prayer from the great American Unitarian liturgist A. Powell Davis. May the little that we know, O God, become enough to guide us, while we seek the truth that no person knows and no person lives without. Amen. May we go in peace.
Yeah, that's helpful.